Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore the science and practice of compassion and how it can transform lives. Today, we're diving into a fascinating topic, compassion-focused chair work. And to help me unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. James Hackley. James is a clinical psychologist at the University of Manchester and Greater Manchester Mental Health NHS Foundation Trust. He completed his PhD under the supervision of Dr. Tobin Bell, who is also a previous guest on Compassion in a T-shirt. They focused on how chair work can help people with depression connect with their ideal compassionate other. His research explores how this unique intervention can help people with depression step outside their usual patterns of self-criticism and experience care in a deeply personal and embodied way. We'll be talking about how chair work brings compassion to life, how it helps navigate fears and blocks to self-compassion, and what all this means for therapy as well as everyday living. Oh, and you can find a link to his paper, which is open access, Seeing Myself Through Someone Else's Eyes, Embodying the Perfect Nurturer in Compassion-Focused Therapy, in the journal OBM Integrative and Complementary Medicine, co-authored with Alison Dixon, Carol Royal, Christopher Moss, Richard Brown and Tobin Bell in the description below. Just a note, we had some internet connectivity problems. And so while the audio is fine, the video is a little bit jumpy. So if you've ever struggled with self-criticism and found it hard to connect with kindness for yourself, then this episode's for you. And so I bring you Dr. James Hackley. Sounds great. All right. Well, Dr. James Hackley, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you for having me.
I'm keen to talk about your paper, which I've mentioned in the introduction, but I actually wanted to start because I mentioned to you a moment ago that the first few paragraphs there in that paper actually really capture a very nice sort of summary, almost like an elevator pitch of CFT and what it is. And I wondered if you could maybe start there. That you sort of mentioned the definition, the social mentality theory, some of the practical skills in cultivating the compassionate mind and the fears, blocks, and resistances. So yeah, what is CFT?
It's a big question, and it's. I think when writing the paper, it was what I realized it was really tricky to write about because there's so much integration that takes place with CFT. But in short, so it's a psychological therapy, it's a psychological model. It's often conceptualized as a third way CBT. It is in the UK at least. Paul Gilbert, the creator of CFT, says that it's a psychological model. It's not a CBT model. So it's based on evolutionary theory. And I think this is really a key point of it in that it really normalizes a lot of what goes on in the mind as being part of the mind, of what we've inherited from the past, of what we haven't chosen. And it integrates attachment theory and neuroscience and various other strands of theory to create what I think is a really sort of all-encapsulating model. One of the key theories involved in CFT is the social mentality theory. So social mentality theory talks about, or it's the idea that we have certain processing systems that we've evolved over time that help us to coordinate relationships with others, that help us to form what he calls reciprocal roles. And the idea here is that the human beings have biosocial goals that we've evolved. So for caring, care seeking, care eliciting. And in order to form these social roles, we need social processing systems that help us to form. And these are based around certain motivations and they organize the mind. So, for example, for a child, when a child is distressed and it needs care, it needs input from an adult, a child automatically has certain processing systems that signal the needs, signal care needs, so that caregivers can respond. And the idea with these processing systems that help us to communicate is that they impress upon the mind of the other, that they influence the mind of the other. But of course, then, in order to have a reciprocal role, the other person in this, so the parent or the caregiver, needs to be able to be competent at detecting those signals as well and responding to them. So the social processing systems that Gilbert talks about that help us to do this, he calls them social mentalities. And social mentalities is a really important part of CFT because he speaks about sort of a certain amount of them, caregiving and care receiving, cooperating. But he also talks about a rank-based mentality. And this is the one that we really think about in CFT quite a lot. Rank-based mentality. And the idea of this is when we're sending and receiving social signals is that we're always outside of conscious awareness, sort of weighing up whether or not we can trust someone, whether they're more or less powerful than us, or whether they're a friend, whether they're foe. So all this happens very automatically, and it has implications for the way we feel in the moment, for the motivations we feel, and for how safe we feel in a relationship. So social mentality theory is really important, actually, and actually is so difficult, I think, to understand that it's not spoken about as much as it should be in CFT, because CFT is relational. But if you read the books about CFT, sometimes the self-help books, sometimes they don't tap into that relational aspect. And there's something that stayed in my mind with that Gilbert spoke about. He says if people are in a rank-based mindset and you try to do cognitive challenging, they're going to experience that as a threat rather than as something that's soothing. So we need to tune into what sort of mentalities are in play during the therapy. So another important component of CFT is the three systems model of emotion. So Gilbert uses a functional analysis, an evolutionary functional analysis of emotion, and neuroscience research to cluster emotions based on their evolved function. So he speaks about having sort of three systems, which it's a heuristic, it's a simplification, but it's a useful heuristic in therapy, I think. Clients certainly respond to it quite well when I've used it with them. But these three systems correspond to threat and defense, so where we're sort of looking out for signals of threat and how to respond to them. We have the drive system where we're looking out for resources and we're motivated and enthusiastic. We're seeking goals. And then we have the soothe system, which is where it's called the rest and digest system, but it's where we're in a state of non-wanting. We're in a state of being able to, the term that seems to resonate with clients when we talk about this is being able to let your guard down, being able to just let your guard down and relax. I think what's important to mention with the soothe system as well is that there is a distinction between safety and safeness. And this is something I talk about with clients as well. And that you can be safe from harm. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're content and safe. So I think so in an imagery practice I did with one client, they had themselves on the top of a hill so they could look out and see where the dangers were. They're not fully relaxed there. Their guard wasn't down. They were sort of still vigilant for danger in that particular imagery practice. So we had to sort of rejig the practice a little bit to get them into a place where they felt safe. The reason why soothe system is so important is because it regulates the other two. So we try to boost the soothe system in CFT to regulate threat and to regulate drive and to bring balance between the three systems. And ultimately, one of the ideas is that states of distress can be brought about by imbalances in these systems. Often clients will have a very large, sort of symbolically very large threat system, maybe a slightly smaller drive system, but quite large, and a very small soothe system. So the idea is to bolster the soothe system. I think the other key part of CFT that's worth mentioning is the tricky brain. So I quite like the concept of the tricky brain. We have the new brain and the old brain. And again, this is part of the normalizing and the de-shaming, sort of the philosophy of de-shaming that's involved in CFT. And it's that we have this old brain with motives and emotions that we share with much of the animal kingdom. But we also, as humans, have this new brain that is capable of imagining the future and replaying the past. And the example Gilbert uses is if a deer escapes a lion, he'll look around and realize the lion is no longer there. He'll return to grazing and relax and he'll be calm again. Whereas human beings have all these thoughts such as, what if there was two lions? What would have happened if the lion caught me? And we can get in these loops. We call them loops where new brain processes stimulate old brain emotions and motives, which again stimulate new brain thinking, and we get in these patterns that perpetuate distress. So they're the sort of key parts. And then we have compassionate mind training, which involves breathing exercises and mindfulness. And then experiential exercises, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. But ultimately, it was designed for people with and for people who are experiencing high levels of shame and self-criticism. And the idea is to cultivate compassion. And to step into these care-based mindsets.
Beautiful, mate. I mean that is a really great sort of snapshot of some pretty complex and comprehensive aspects to CFT, isn't it? Like you said, it's not an easy one to really sum up, and you did a wonderful job. But yeah, the social mentality theory, that notion of humans as social beings, and sort of how we exist in relationship with others, and then the way that can, the external can also become internal. And then we sometimes start to have those same relationships with ourselves, sometimes through the social rank starts to come in as self-criticism. And then, yeah, that can lead to the sort of the psychological distress that you're talking about. How can we cultivate the compassionate mind? And your study really starts to look at that through combining, I suppose, compassionate imagery and chair work. People can sometimes struggle with imagery. I've noticed in my own clinical work, and you allude to this in the paper too. That might chair work be a way in to help people to really sort of work with and play with and sort of explore the idea of a imagery around a compassionate other. So, what is chair work then? How would you kind of sum that up, and how does it fit, I suppose, within CFT?
So Chairwork's got a long history in therapy, in the therapeutic arena. So it started with Jacob Moreno, and he spoke about a concept called surplus reality, and he wanted people to play out their fantasies using chairs. I mean, I suppose what I should say to begin with is, so it's using chairs and movement between chairs for therapeutic ends, and dialogue between different parts of ourselves. So in terms of a basic theory, Chairwork would say that the mind is a society of mind. It's made of multiple parts, sub-personalities, and so on. And that these different parts, if you separate them out, they can communicate with one another. So Jake Moreno started with Chairwork, and he wanted to, he with a nice quote, he says, to bridge the gap between inner and outer worlds, which I think is
Hmm.
quite a nice quote. And then Fritz Perls sort of took it on. And he another nice quote from Fritz Perls was, it's not enough to talk about our experiences. We have to psychologically return to them. And there's something about Chairwork that allows people to do that. So in Chairwork, generally, there's certain set pieces you'll play out, and you might put. So a really common one is putting the critic on the chair and going and embodying the critic. But we can also, there's certain set pieces that involve speaking to people from our life or from our past. So Chairwork is really versatile. You can use it in a lot of formats, and actually, I use it quite in my own work. Just in small moments, if you see someone enact a sort of rank-based mentality in the moment, if they get really self-critical, you can just swap seats with them, do what they just did. So you sort of role play what they did, and then you can see how they react to it. And usually they go, "Goodness me, I'm being really mean to myself," and they can see it from that perspective, but not when they're in the original chair. So chair work involves a lot of movement between chairs. But, it involves embodying different parts of ourselves or different people from our past and creating dialogue between these different parts. In CFT, I suppose that the sort of the Tobin calls it, Tobin Bell, who maybe you've had on before on your podcast. Tobin Bell calls CFT and chairwork a match of theory and practice, because again, CFT also views the mind as multi-modal, as made up of different brain states, different parts that, and I think this is the key really, that at times conflict. And when there is conflict between these parts, it can be very disorganizing. And I think it's sort of a common conflict might be one between getting along or getting ahead. So if we're at work and a colleague asks for help, something that we know about, then there's a little bit of an internal conflict there of whether we want to be competitive or whether we want to be caring. So CFT and chair seem to fit together quite nicely. I think another part of CFT that sort of Gilbert talks about is that we can be encapsulated in certain mentalities, or certain self parts can dominate experience, internal experience. And in Chairwork, we can again use it to separate out these different parts and to embody different parts and build up sort of different representations of self that might be sort of down-regulated or shut off from experience because of threat processing. So in CFT, the distinctive part of CFT chairwork is building up the compassionate chair, which will involve the client embodying the compassionate attributes and then sitting in a chair and trying to direct compassion to different strands of experience or different parts of the self. And there's a few set pieces again, which sort of Tobin's led on researching. So you've got the sort of compassionate chair work for self-criticism, where we have the self-critic there. And this is a really nice exercise because we're not trying to sort of get rid of the critic or to sort of cognitively challenge it away. We're trying to understand it. We're trying to understand the emotions that are behind it, the function that it's serving, often a protective function, and we're trying to understand its origins. And by using chair work and sort of activating these sort of implicational cognitive structures, this deeper processing, it seems to bring all that stuff to the surface. It can be really useful. But then you have multiple selves chair work, where you separate all the different emotions into different chairs and you have them converse with one another. And then we have the one that Tobin and I did, which is where we embody the compassionate other. So it's really useful. It's sort of it's quite powerful. I think this is the thing with chair that always strikes me is it's very powerful. It's emotionally evocative. And often at the end of therapy, if I say to clients, where was the turning point for you? And that a lot of the time they say it was when we did chair work.
Mm. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's so interesting. I've sort of talked before about how my grandmother got me into psychology, actually, and she was a GP back in the day, and she introduced me to Carl Rogers on being a person was one book, but she also was really into Fritz Perls at the time, and for a reason I'm not sure, I really gravitated towards Carl, and but she was certainly very kind of interested in Fritz Perls and did a lot of work with couples and, sort of did the chair work as well and some of the Gestalt sort of approach she used and so on. And you've reminded me I must dive back into some of Fritz's work as well. But it's powerful stuff. I agree with you. That kind of that agility in a way, that therapist agility to sort of notice something and then bring movement in and shifting about and moving chairs or swapping chairs, and that ability to create a different perspective and to actually feel something different, to even have a different perspective on the critic, not so much to then become critical of the critic, because that would be, the dragon eating its own tail or something, but to have that kind of compassionate understanding of the critic and where it arises from in the social mentalities, in the social rank stuff, in amongst the threat and drive or whatever it might be, and being able to work with it. Your study did try to use chair, or did effectively use chair work, but more around sort of developing a sense of a compassionate other. And often an imagery practice that we might use, developing the compassionate other using imagery with the eyes closed and so on. But how did you actually, yeah, just explain the exercise and how you brought those two together.
So with the compassionate other imagery exercise, so it's some of the theoretical points we spoke about before is sort of tapping into them. So we're trying to develop a caring image so we can shift people into care-based mentalities, but we're also using these new brain competencies to generate signals of caring. And so the idea sort of initially with the imagery practice is that you generate an image or you build an image in the mind of someone who's sort of perfectly caring, or it's a perfect nurturer. Another researcher has called it perfect nurturer. And sort of this image embodies all the compassionate attributes and the compassionate qualities. And sort of a question that I tend to ask clients is, when you have a problem, what is it you need in that moment from someone to give you support? What would feel good? What are the needs that are going unmet? And so then people begin to construct this image. And the process of that's quite interesting because, first of all, you sort of tune into who people are picking, and often people find it tricky to identify someone. Sometimes people identify self-critical compassionate others, which of course
Mm,
is counterproductive, which sort of gives you an insight into how married they are to certain beliefs that self-criticism is positive, sort of meta beliefs that it's doing something good for them. Well, you construct this image, and this image can be sort of anything people want it to be. It can be a character from a book, it can be an animal. The idea really is that it's as long as it's sentient and it can communicate. And then you identify a problem that the client is having, and then you try to get them to imagine this image offering them care. And again, the idea here is that it's sort of we're imagining signals of caregiving through the image with the aim of sort of stimulating a care receiving mindset. So we're helping them to step out of rank-based mentalities. That's sort of the key aim. So we did it through Chairwork. So again, the construction of the image followed the same processes as it would for the imagery exercise. But then rather than have people sit still and close their eyes and imagine the image, which people can find pretty tricky, by the way. And then there's another
mm,
study that supervised, and they found that when people struggled to generate the image, they actually became self-critical. So
mm.
it's important to establish with clients whether or not, or how easily they're finding it to create this image. Of course, the image doesn't need to be perfect. It's more of a sort of a sense, but yeah, important to know. And then, so once we had the image build up, we introduced a third chair, and we ask clients to go and become their image. So I don't know, an example of one might be, well, example of one was Mrs. Doubtfire. So sort
Oh,
of
okay.
just quite nice, and this sort of motherly, maternal, jokey but sort of loving and quite humorous character. So they went and they sat there, and we said to them, so how do you feel now? What do you notice is different? Where do you feel the motivation and the care and what sort of thoughts are going through your mind now? You're this, now you're Mrs. Doubtfire, you know. And then we would ask them to look at themselves in the original chair, experiencing the distress. And again, the idea is we were trying to imagine them picturing signals of someone who is in need of care. So generate those that care-based mentality, to cultivate it. And then so they would give care back to themselves in the original chair. Of course, the chair's empty, but this is where the imagery comes in. Then we would have them move back to themselves, and we'd explore with them how it felt to receive that care and the compassion. And then you move between the chairs a few times to see how they experience it, to see what's going on for them. And again, something I forgot to mention at the start is this is of course tapping into different what we call flows of compassion.
Mm,
So in one chair here, we're enacting the giving of care, so a sort of other or self to other flow of compassion, and then we're asking them to flip over into the chair and receive that compassion. And that's important because we know that people have different problems with different flows. You know, people can have the three flows from self to self, from other to self, and self to other. They're correlated but not perfectly, which means there's different processes involved. So, so we're trying to get them to enact these different flows, and then we explore it. We explore the experience of giving and receiving care, and what shows up for them, and of course, what often shows up for people is problems, is difficulties with giving, which which I think you did a paper on fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion.
yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's a really great table in your paper, table two, actually, that I would draw people's attention to. It steps through what you just described, really. You know, there's 8 steps in the table, I guess, but
You know the
yeah,
paper better than
I
me.
have it up on my screen. But it did stand out to me as a really useful table because yeah, it just sort of steps out exactly what we're trying to do when using chair work with the compassionate other. We're trying to identify a problem and sort of develop a sense or an image of the compassionate other. We imagine them in that other chair. We then change seats to embody that compassionate other. We then sort of offer compassion to the ourselves in the other chair, or the image, I suppose, of ourselves in the other chair. At some point, we swap back again and think about what it feels like to receive that compassion. It is really a great example of where those flows of compassion really are flowing, aren't they? They flow back and forward, and in some ways, self-compassion is partly receiving and partly giving, I suppose. Those two elements are there in self-compassion in a way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, in self-compassion, you're same as self-criticism, where you're playing out both roles. You're part of both roles. In self-criticism, you're both the critic, and experience the anger of the critic and the disappointment, but you're also the criticized and feel beaten down. So it's the same with this compassion. So in this exercise, what I like about it is really we're trying to tap into all three flows of compassion, and that means we can explore the experience of all three flows in one exercise. So I think one of the big findings from this really was that people or therapists who think of this as not just an intervention. Sorry, there's some angry drivers peeping. Not just as an intervention, but as an assessment tool as well. It yielded a lot of information for formulation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of we're sort of as the therapist, we're listening, we're observing, we're kind of listening with our ears and our eyes, trying to notice, yeah, what information is coming back in terms of the three flows, the fears, blocks, and resistances, but also, sometimes the wisdom is profound, isn't it? When people really engaging with the exercise and moving into the chair of the compassionate other, and then start to talk about, offering sort of ideas to the suffering self or whatever. The wisdom that kind of arises is really very impressive.
Well, that's one thing I really love about doing this sort of with clients is that they know what they need. You know, once you get them sort of moving around and into a different mindset or into a different perspective, then they can see what they need. They have the answers within them. But it's difficult to see it. We will know if we're sort of swamped in sadness or very anxious. It's hard to look beyond that perspective. And what Chairwork seems to allow people to do is to move beyond the perspective. And so really we're not then telling clients what to do or what they need. They're moving into these different positions, seeing their distress, and then they're generating the responses themselves. And that's what I think is really powerful about this is that then they're modeling exactly what they need to do outside of therapy and beyond therapy.
Mm. Yeah, that's the power in a way of the chair work itself, isn't it? Is that it creates the structure around which sort of allows and invites and helps to bring to the surface, that intuitive wisdom that Paul also talks about. That it's sort of just a mechanism of guided discovery. We're not necessarily the ones to give the wise words, but rather create this experience whereby the client might discover those things for themselves. One of the key themes from your research was care that feels real. So can you just sort of share a bit about that or what that might mean, how the chair work and the compassionate other chair work was really experienced by some of those participants?
Yeah, so this was an interesting theme. And I think the reason why it interested me a lot, because was the one that surprised the participants.
Aha.
So they sort of, when you ask people to do chair, they sort of look at you as if you're, asking them to do something really bizarre, which in a way you are. Um, but then it's really powerful. And this is what clients spoke about. So they sort of said that when they went and became that compassionate other, they noticed this shift, this internal shift, as well as sort of, so they physically moved, but they noticed different motivations arising, which again really taps into CFT theory, into the social mentality theory. So all of a sudden they noticed the motivation to care for someone else arising within them. They noticed that they had feelings towards this person in the chair, who of course was them, experiencing some distress. But they also spoke about sort of mentalizing in a way as we would when we're giving care. So they were sort of thinking or focusing on this other person. So they had all these experiences that really made them feel as though they were this other person caring for someone else. So that was so they'd accessed a caregiving social mentality. But then when we asked people to go back to the original chair, they spoke about it in the sort of in the converse. They said, "Well, I really
Mm.
felt like the person was caring for me. I really
Yes.
felt like there was someone there." And then they sort of people spoke of a warm presence. They really said that they felt like they were in dialogue and that they were receiving new communication. I think this is the key part, really. It was stuff that they sort of beforehand hadn't been able to generate, patterns of thought and feeling they hadn't been able to generate before. So they felt like they were receiving it, and ultimately a lot of the participants said, and I felt soothed after. I did feel soothed. I felt calmed. So it would sort of what we can take from that is that this sense that we seem to have activated sort of a caregiving and care receiving mentality that formed a successful reciprocal role between just themselves playing out. I think what's important to note in this is that clients as well, and this is something again to note for therapists, is if they noticed that they a shift when they got into these care-based mentalities, it probably tells us they were in a rank-based mentality beforehand.
Hmm.
Um,
Mm.
so without sort of knowing that this shift took place, and without the moving and sort of exploring this, then again, that risk of sort of clients remaining in a sort of threat type of processing and that blocking of the work is there. So I think that was another sort of implicit finding of that theme. But yeah, clients really experienced a sense of caring for someone else, and they really experienced a sense of being cared for, even though it was just them in the room, sort of doing the exercise.
Yeah, I really loved that in the findings, the way that the reciprocal piece that you were saying, the two directions, they were literally able to shift with their body and with this kind of motivation and feel the care giving and then the care receiving. Just sort of kind of a rise. I mean, they they were participants who were fairly well versed in CFT, I think, and this was a single session chairwork session that was then, you interviewed the participants to explore their experiences. But when sort of timed right, I guess, in the treatment plan, it can have these really, they used words like genuine or authentic, and the feeling there was very real.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting, and I think again that the participants were surprised by it. That was
Mm,
really what I quite liked
mm.
when we explored this.
One of the comments that stood out for me, and it was when in the theme one, care that feels real, one of the clients or the participants said, I got a bit emotional at one point, which I felt a bit stupid for, because I'm not actually this person I've chosen, and so on. And it was just, yeah, I think that was what you were alluding to before. When we really listen to the client and their experience of things, that they'll give you information. I mean, is that fears, blocks, and resistances arising there, do you think, or is it something else?
And I mean, I think so. It's in this exercise a lot of I think it is a fear block and resistance. So they were sort of self-conscious. It's
Mm,
not a fear block and resistance. I think in the usual sense of how we talk about them in CFT. This was more clients felt very silly about doing the exercise at first. So in the third theme we talk about this. They sort of they felt an uncomfortable self-consciousness at the prospect of having to play out these things. And I think that, again, this is what um, one of the outcomes from this really was for therapists was to sort of normalize and anticipate this. So with clients, you might say, "This might sound a little strange, but do you mind giving something a go?" So you're sort of anticipating it. But
mm,
I think also there's maybe something in there about fear blocks and resistances in the typical sense of how we discuss them in CFT. And I think this so the exercise really brought these out. So people found it really tricky to give care to themselves and to allow themselves to receive it. And again, often people might see this as a well, it is a challenge, but they might see it as a problem. But it's not a problem per se, because in CFT we want to identify FBRs, these fears, blocks, and resistances. So when this stuff showed up, it was important stuff, and it's something to be explored and to be formulated in therapy rather than a problem per se.
mm.
But yeah,
Yeah, I
I
appreciate.
think I think that was a fear, block, and resistance coming up. Yeah.
Well, but I like how you have differentiated it, because I think not everything is sort of literally fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. In some ways, that was a block to the chair work, feeling self-conscious and so on, which I guess starts to remind us again of the social rank kind of side of things, and the self-conscious emotions and embarrassment, or sort of even shame potentially, arising, which isn't directly a fear or block or resistance to compassion, but it's obviously very related because of the self-consciousness that's arising there, and the self-criticism that I guess comes out of that self-consciousness, which we do often find actually that self-criticism can be a block to self-compassion. So it's a little bit maybe a Venn diagram there where there's two
Yeah,
kind of bits, but they're overlapping.
for sure. And I think the thing to remember with fears, blocks, and resistances is that we have them for all types of experiences, not just for compassion. So
Mm.
this is, I mean, I see Chairwork as a form of play. So if a child grows up and whenever they play, they're criticized, then we'll have FBRs for play. We'll have sort of inhibitions
Yes.
that stop them from going through with it. So I think that was really what's showing up for this with people. You're asking them to engage in what is a very playful exercise in many ways. It's based in imagery, it's based in the imagination. We're moving around, we're speaking to people who aren't there. So if people have had difficult experiences with play growing up, or indeed no experiences with play growing up, then those FBRs for play will be activated when you ask them to do this as well,
Mm.
which often happens, you know. But again, and then you talk about sort of you can explore that and formulate that. You know, it's not okay. Well, we won't do it then. It's tell me more about what's going on for you when we ask to do this. When I ask you to do this exercise.
Mm. You briefly touched on how to introduce chair work a moment ago to kind of just preempt some of this, but could you elaborate a little bit? Like what might be the way to introduce the idea of chair work as a technique and but in a way that helps to, I'm not sure, just help them to feel comfortable and safe with proceeding with that.
So I think it largely depends on the client that you're working with as
Mm.
well, and the relationship that you've already got with them, at what point in therapy you're doing it. So if I'm working with someone who maybe I've had a few sessions with them and we're sort of getting on quite well, then I'll try to be quite spontaneous in the way I introduce it. So as I mentioned earlier, if I see sort of self-criticism in play, I won't give it much pretext, and I might just say, "Do you mind if we just swap chairs for a minute?" And and actually, part of the power of that, I think, is not saying anything, not giving any instruction. So I'll just play out what they've just done and I'll say, I look at them and say, tell me what you're thinking. And they know straight away. They say, God, I'm being awful to myself. If clients sort of with more complex attachment histories and maybe have more difficulties with trust, then I'll just give a little introduction, say sometimes we might move around a little bit and we might use chairs and play different parts of ourselves. But I'll always say, and it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel tricky, and you might look at me as if sort of lost it a little bit. But would you humor me a little bit and give it a go? Of course, the bottom line is that if people don't want to do it, then you don't make them do it.
Mm.
Um, but I think I think it's sort of been several years now of using chair. There's only ever been one client who's just flatline said no. Most clients are pretty open to the idea, and once you tell them about what chair it might be able to do or what we're looking for with it, then they get on board with it.
Mm.
A lot of it comes down as well to your confidence as a therapist. And I think this is something that another takeaway from the study really was that the three therapists we trained up, they had one 3 hour workshop on chair work, and then they went and did it really well. And I know, again, it's not been your paper as well, but sort of looking at therapist fears for chair work.
Mm.
Uh, and one of them was just that therapists are anxious about doing it because they've not done it much. So what we've sort of showed here is that if you learn some of the basic principles of this and you maybe have a step-by-step guide to begin with, is that as a therapist you can do it confidently, and then of course confidence and sort of assurance is infectious, and the clients will trust that and give it a go.
Mm. Yeah, some really great tips there. I think for the client's sake, it might be something that kind of in amongst other things, let them know might be part of therapy going forward. You might do the occasional more spontaneous one that doesn't require a lot of description or preempting, but just sort of in the moment. Then you might just gradually build, I suppose, and it's a little bit gradual exposure
I
and
think
sort of getting used to it across the treatment plan, maybe.
I think also as well is that to begin with, usually I'll involve myself in it. So they'll see me not being particularly self-conscious. I'll might maybe role play their self-critic or role play my own self-critic or so on. And so that sort of tones down the embarrassment because we're seeing that I'm just there doing it as well.
Mm,
So if you
mm,
form that strong, if you form that good relationship and you're sort of acting as a bit of a safe base, the therapeutic environment becomes a bit of a safe base. Then from that point you can explore
mm,
sort of attachment theory, sort of safe haven, safe and safe base. So we create the safe haven, and from there we can head off into different techniques. The client
mm,
feels safe to.
mm. Which sort of speaks to the therapist uh, skills and experience and confidence that you were mentioning. You know, if the therapist is sort of confident and moves into these things and sort of demonstrates it or uses it in a way that kind of actually is experienced in a powerful way, then the person's feels in safe hands, I suppose, and is able
Yeah.
to go ahead and give these things a try. Because the last little piece there was drawing meaning from the experience. I mean, despite some of the challenges and some of the self-conscious feelings that might have arisen and so on, um, it also was a very meaningful experience for people.
Yes. So this was, of course, if it didn't have the meaning, then and the sort of the benefit, then we probably wouldn't do it. But
Yeah, I suppose so.
yeah. So I think this is one of, and again, the key takeaway really that I said before, and I think sort of I'll say again is that this was an assessment tool as well as an intervention tool. So a lot of the participants spoke about the blocks that came up or the difficulties they had being really important for them, and sort of they weren't aware of it. Sort of, some had difficulties with giving compassion to themselves, some had difficulties receiving it. But then they'll say, and I wasn't aware of that beforehand. So it gave insights that sort of opened up new avenues for therapy, really. But there's also something like the experiential nature of it. I think I remember there's one quote of a participant who said, and it showed me that I could do it. So
Mm,
there was grief, so there was an inhibition sort of at play in the mind for this client where she just felt like she couldn't do compassion. She couldn't do caring for herself. And then actually she did this exercise and embodied it, used the body to sort of build up from the bottom up, as it were, rather than the top down. And challenge some of these beliefs that were there about being unable to give compassion.
mm,
But yeah, and then it's sort of if we can draw out these fears and blocks, then they're there for work as well. So if someone it's pretty common for people to say, well, I don't feel as though I deserve the compassion. I don't feel as though I deserve the care. And then once that's out, it's not like that's not the end point. You follow that and you say, well, where does this come from? What memories are associated with this particular feeling? How old were you when you first felt this feeling? And then actually, I will use chair work, not necessarily CFT chair work, but to work with that as well. So often, once we get that and we have an age and an image of the client at that particular point where they first felt this thing, then we might put the child at that age on the chair as well. Or we might have the client go and become that 10-year-old. And this is really powerful. Um, I remember one session where I asked the client to imagine their 10-year-old self when they first felt this particular feeling they were feeling now, this one they'd had a really difficult time with. And as soon as they sat in the other chair and imagined themselves as a child, they just burst out in tears. And it was the first time, really, that child, that sort of that version of that child in mind, had ever been given sympathy. Because when they were growing up, they were just criticized and bullied. So, so it's sort of identifying these blocks. Really, is the work that
mm,
allow the clear way for compassion to be cultivated.
mm,
And of course, it's modeling and it's building up these different representations of self that can then challenge sort of more entrenched negative self representations. Um, so yeah, clients. I think what's important as well is they enjoyed it, and clients enjoyed doing it. Um,
right.
therapy doesn't need to be. Therapy's tough. So I always set out therapy and say it's not easy. Good therapy is tough. When you bring in these playful exercises they like, and the client sometimes enjoys them, it's really useful. I think something with chair work as well is that it's really distinctive, so it stays in mind. It's an easily triggered memory after the event.
Yes.
And I think I said to you earlier that at the end of therapy, often clients say that chair work it stays in mind for them.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
No.
it brings out these blocks, it brings out these challenges, but then that highlights avenues for further work. They get this experiential um, experience. they get this experience of actually being compassionate, which shakes the system a little bit.
Yeah, and kind of sticks. Yeah, that it's sort of important what you're saying because we often worry about, did the exercise work or something, and actually it's not about these exercise working or not working. It's, whatever happens is actually food for thought or grist for the mill or something like that. And not least the fears, blocks, and resistances when they arise, but even the self-consciousness and the stuff you mentioned around play, but certainly, the shift in motivational sort of state and being able to sort of feel that and experience it. And that's sort of some of the key takeaways. You mentioned something there that I noticed in the some of the comments or the quotes from participants, feelings of sadness or feelings, I think, of sympathy, and I often find that people can still worry about sympathy. They feel that sympathy is too much like pity or something like that, or empathy good, sympathy bad. It's something I think about, when, well, also when training CFT, but with clients as well. Do you have any comments on that? Like, what are your thoughts about that, the role of chair work in just helping create a kind of a sort of feeling sympathetically moved by one's
Mhm.
own pain and distress and suffering?
Well, I think the key, I mean, I don't see sympathy as a bad thing.
No.
So just, and I think the key really is so the definition of compassion is to a sensitivity to suffering in the self and others, with a motivation to alleviate and prevent it. So the first part of that, the first psychology involved in compassion, is turning towards and being moved by suffering, being moved by pain and suffering. So if clients can feel this sense of sympathy, then actually what it's telling me is that they're turning towards the suffering rather than turning away, which has been generally, which is the usual way they've approached it in life, or they've learned to approach it through experiences, is by pushing it away, trying to distance from it. So what it tells me if clients are sympathetic towards themselves is that they're now tapping into that first psychology. They're turning towards the distress. So actually, for me, it's always a good point in therapy. I think grief. I think you mentioned sort of sadness there. Grief's a little different to thinking that um, once we turn towards this sadness and we really see it there, it sort of opens the floodgates. Gilbert calls it frozen grief. This sort of when we've had these attachment experiences that have been painful, and we learn to distance from them. When we get this emotional warmth going again and start turning towards it, the first thing we see there is all the pain. There's all the pain in the person's attachment history. So again, if people become sad doing this, then actually, again, it's a good sign for me from a therapeutic point of view because they're now leaning into all the stuff in the past that maybe they've had to distance from as a safety strategy, and we can do that together in therapy. So sympathy and sadness, grief, to me, they're always signals or signatures that the therapy is moving in the right direction.
Hmm. Yeah, good. No, sadness. Sometimes I associate sadness or sorrow with sympathy, I suppose. But I think you make a really important point about a sort of a sadness that is also the grief that just comes sometimes rushing in when we kind of open our heart to our own suffering and see that in ourselves, or like you mentioned, imagining ourselves as that young vulnerable child who was, harmed in that way, and the grief that's there. And Gilbert often talks about the rage as well, the rage that is perhaps present and
Yeah.
suppressed or held back or something, because it's, well, sadness and rage, they're frightening sorts of emotions, aren't they? And so mm,
Part of the threat system. And I think that this with rage and anger as well, it's another really important emotion in CFT, and I'll use that for some CFT chair work as well. I mean, you'll do it in the multiple cells one, but when we get there, so they might imagine the child in the chair, and then this is where I see a chair work session can sort of start rolling out and become really long. But so if we access that sadness, we then might do some unfinished business and bring the parent in, and this is where it can get. This is where it's play. So we might. So there's a few times where I've had person being their compassionate self. They've had their younger self next to them on a chair,
Mm.
and they're speaking to the person, the parent, whoever who didn't meet their needs, or who was mean to them, or who abused them, which is a sort of similar to sort of schema therapy, where you step in to the image to try to to meet the needs, the basic needs of the client. But yeah, and then that one, anger is really important. I think what's really fascinating when I have done that one is, so often clients will say, whenever I'm with that parent, I feel like the child I was years ago, even though they're an adult now. And when they do that exercise, and we imagine that whoever it was in that chair who was not good for them, you see them sort of become that child again. They go a little bit meek and a little bit scared. Um, so you can see now they're tapping in, they're being pushed back into a different state, as it were. So then modeling this sort of healthy aggression, standing up for yourself, can be really transformative as well, because it's their sort of restructuring a memory, a core emotional memory that's been with them for a long time, and it still is really easily triggered.
Mm. Yeah, it's amazing process for someone to go through. It really speaks to the strength and courage, and the wisdom, the strength, the courage, and that commitment to care and be helpful. It just weaves through all of this, doesn't it? And it takes enormous amounts of those kind of qualities to face the pain that perhaps we've been through. And you're sort of inspiring in a way, I think, for other therapists who lots of people do feel a little bit tentative around chair work, but what you say is very inspiring. There's multiple moments across a treatment plan where chair work might just create that experiential bang for the buck sort of thing, that people take away. Whether it's in that sort of, I guess, maybe slightly earlier stage of developing the compassionate other or the compassionate self, or whether it's working with self-criticism. And I really find that notion of the critic and the criticized in their different chairs and working with that, or whether it's with the multiple selves work and these different, very powerful emotions using chair work historically in terms of imagining a younger self. It's really it's powerful stuff. So what would be your concluding remarks, really, like, especially from the paper? I mean, what would you say are some of the key takeaways for us, given all those various findings?
Uh, I mean, so some of the things that have stuck out for me in this, really, is that, so it didn't take long to train therapists to do this very competently, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so, I mean, when I did my Tobin, basically, he did some teaching for us, which got me onto it. And then he just gave me some one-to-one supervision for an hour. We just did the exercise, and then sort of you go with it and you play with it from there. So that's sort of one thing. I think another thing is to remember that therapy does not need to be a static endeavor. It's
Mm.
the mind and the body, and sort of this Cartesian dualism sort of seeps into therapy still sometimes, but the mind and body are one. It is one system. And we know from research on embodied cognition that changes in the body can bring about changes in emotion. So when we move around and use the body, we can stimulate different types of thinking and feeling. I think another key takeaway is looking at the type of social mentality that clients are in the session as well. Because it might, for all intents and purposes, appear that you're having a good conversation with them, but there'll be little signs that maybe they're viewing you in a sort of power dynamic way, whether or not. I think one sort of common hint for me that people in an ant-based mentality is, if they sort of, and people should be able to do this, and it's fine, but they're sort of questioning your capabilities or credential, how intelligent you are and stuff. They're looking for a powerful person there to lead them. There needs to be a certain amount of that, because they need to trust you and know that you know what you're on about. But they're sort of wondering if you're powerful enough, to
Mm.
be a therapist. Another one might be, sort of, clients worry about looking silly or stupid in front of you. And that would indicate again to me that they're sort of still in a rank-based mindset. They're still weighing you up as someone who potentially is a threat. So when we do this exercise, and we move people between the different mentalities. If they say, I noticed a big shift and a big difference, then that might indicate that previously, it might not, but it might indicate that they were sort of still in that rank-based mentality with you in the room, which is
Mm,
really important because therapy is going to move pretty slowly if they're still in a rank-based mindset.
mm,
Um, but yeah, the chair, and I think sort of something you mentioned earlier as well is that people have a real difficulty sometimes with imagery. There's a condition called aphantasia, aphantasia being the ancient Greek word for sort of image or eye, mind's eye, and A being the negative prefix to that. So some people have a condition where they don't see mental images in them. Uh, some people just struggle with mental imagery, including myself. If I try and picture an image, it's pretty blurry, you know. So a way of we can explore and ask clients about that is really important because if we just do imagery exercises with them, we don't ask them how they're finding it or whether or not they feel capable of doing it, and we know that that can lead to self-criticism. So using the chair work or exploring that imagery, and then using the chair work as an alternative if clients do have difficulty with imagery, it's another key take there, I think.
mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the big one is that yeah, it really helps people feel kind of surprised, but also, pleased with the effect of it. And it really gives them a different experience and something that they can take away and bringing that kind of exercise, I think, into our therapeutic work is really, it's a massive opportunity, I think, in terms of being, trying to be helpful. So
Mhm.
what's just before I let you go, what's next for Dr. James Hackley? What are you are you doing further research on this, or what's happening next?
So Tobin and I are just finishing up a review on shame memories. Um,
Okay,
so we're having a look at that. And then for the time being, I've recently started a new role, so I'm just going to settle into that. And then I think so. There's Chairwork is and CFT sort of research. I'm hoping there's going to be more to come. But for now, I'm going to enjoy using it and polishing the skills in practice, I think.
beautiful. That sounds like a really great idea. Doing the thing.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, mate, no, it's a great paper. As I say, the intro stands alone in some ways, but also these are really interesting and useful findings. The good thing is it's actually an open access paper, so everyone can go and have a look at that. I'll include it in the description, of course, and so on. But thank you for coming and speaking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been nice to be
Great.
here.
Good, good.